Hey everyone, welcome back to Spirits of Asia. There's something about Malaysia that draws people in the food, the culture, the mix of old traditions with modern life. But what many visitors don't realize is that beneath all that beauty lies a world most outsiders never see. A world where ancient beliefs about spirits, curses, and supernatural forces still run very deep. Tonight's story is about a young backpacker from Australia who learned this lesson the hard way. Someone who thought accepting a simple gift from a stranger would be harmless. Someone who discovered that in certain parts of Asia, not everything offered freely should be taken home. This incident happened in 2019 in Kuala Lumpur, shared by someone I'll call James, a 24-year-old from Melbourne who was on his first solo trip through Southeast Asia. He was documenting his journey on social media, posting about the incredible temples, the street food, the friendly locals. But there was one encounter he never posted about. One experience that changed everything. What started as an innocent conversation with a local woman at a night market ended with James fighting for his sanity, his health, and eventually his life. This is his story, and it's a warning about why you should never, ever accept spiritual items from strangers, especially in places where the supernatural is taken very seriously. As usual, I'll break down the cultural background at the end, so stick around if you want to understand what really happened to James and why this type of encounter is more common than you might think. James had been traveling for 3 weeks when he arrived in Kuala Lumpur. He was the kind of traveler who liked to experience everything authentically, staying in hostels, eating street food, talking to locals, rather than just following tourist guides. His Instagram was full of pictures from temples in Thailand, beaches in the Philippines, and now the bustling streets of Malaysia's capital. He was staying in a backpacker hostel in Bukit Bintang, the kind of place where you meet other travelers from around the world. But James preferred exploring on his own. He liked the freedom of wandering without a plan, discovering hidden corners of the city that most tourists never see. It was his second night in KL when he decided to check out the Petaling Street night market in Chinatown. The place was alive with activity, vendors calling out their wares, the smell of satay and char kway teow filling the air, tourists haggling over fake designer bags and watches. James loved the energy of it all. He was walking through the market, just soaking in the atmosphere, when an elderly Chinese woman approached him. She looked to be in her 60s, wearing a simple floral blouse and black pants. Nothing unusual about her appearance, except for her eyes. James would later describe them as incredibly intense, like she was looking right through him. She smiled and started speaking to him in broken English, asking where he was from, how long he'd been in Malaysia, usual questions tourists get. James was friendly, happy to chat. He told her about his travels, how much he was enjoying Malaysia, how different it was from Australia. The woman nodded along, seeming genuinely interested. Then she said something that caught him off guard. "You have very good energy," she said, still smiling. "Very pure, but also very vulnerable. You need protection here." James laughed it off. Protection from what? The woman's expression grew more serious. Malaysia is old country. Many spirits here, some good, some not so good. Young travelers, like you, they attract attention, not always the kind you want. She reached into a small bag she was carrying and pulled out what looked like a small cloth pouch, about the size of a coin purse. It was dark red fabric, worn and faded, with what appeared to be some kind of symbol embroidered on it in black thread. James couldn't make out what the symbol was, but it looked old, traditional. "This is for protection," she said, holding it out to him. "My grandmother made these very powerful. Keep bad spirits away." James hesitated. He wasn't superstitious, but he also didn't want to be rude. The woman seemed sincere, even concerned for his well-being, and it was just a small pouch, probably filled with herbs or something traditional. "I couldn't take that," he said politely. "It must be valuable." The woman shook her head firmly. "No money. Is gift. You are guest in my country. We must protect guest." She pressed the pouch into his hand. "You carry this while in Malaysia. Very important. Promise me." Something about the urgency in her voice made James accept it. He tucked the pouch into his backpack pocket and thanked her. The woman smiled again, but this time it seemed different, more satisfied than friendly. "Remember," she said as she turned to walk away. "Keep with you always while here. Don't take off. Don't let anyone else touch. Very important." James watched her disappear back into the crowd, feeling slightly bewildered by the whole encounter. He didn't think much more about it that night, just went back to his hostel and crashed. The next morning, James woke up feeling strange, not sick exactly, but off somehow, like he hadn't slept well, even though he'd been exhausted. He chalked it up to the heat and humidity, grabbed some breakfast, and headed out to explore more of the city. He spent the day visiting the Batu Caves, taking the typical tourist photos, posting them to his Instagram stories. But something felt different. He kept getting this sensation that someone was watching him, even when he was alone. Several times he turned around, expecting to see someone behind him, but there was never anyone there. That night, back at the hostel, James was scrolling through his photos when he noticed something odd. In several of the pictures he'd taken at the caves, there seemed to be a shadow that didn't belong. Not a person, just a dark shape that appeared in the background of multiple shots. It was subtle, probably just an artifact from his phone camera, but it was definitely there. He showed the photos to his roommate, a British guy named Tom, who'd been backpacking for months. "Mate, that's just the lighting," Tom said, barely glancing at the screen. "These phone cameras are rubbish in bright sun." James nodded, but something about it bothered him. The shadows seemed to be in the same position relative to him in every photo, like it was following him. The third day, James decided to visit the Islamic Arts Museum. He'd read good things about it online, and he was interested in learning more about Malaysian culture. But as soon as he walked into the building, that feeling of being watched intensified. He was looking at a display of traditional Malaysian crafts when he felt someone tap his shoulder. He turned around, but no one was there. The closest person was an elderly Malaysian man about 10 feet away, clearly absorbed in reading a plaque about Islamic calligraphy. James tried to shake it off and continued through the museum, but the feeling persisted. Worse, he started hearing things, whispers in a language he didn't understand, coming from behind him or just at the edge of his hearing. Every time he turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time he left the museum, James was genuinely unsettled. He wasn't someone who believed in ghosts or spirits, but something was definitely wrong. He felt watched, followed, like there was a presence just out of sight that wouldn't leave him alone. That evening, he called his girlfriend Sarah back in Melbourne. "I'm probably just tired," he told her, trying to sound casual, "but I've been having the weirdest experiences here, like someone's following me, but there's never anyone there." Sarah was concerned but practical. "Maybe you're just overwhelmed? You've been traveling for weeks. Maybe you need a rest day." James agreed to take it easy the next day, but privately he was starting to wonder if the strange feelings had something to do with the pouch the old woman had given him. He pulled it out of his backpack and examined it more closely. The fabric was old, definitely handmade. The symbol embroidered on it looked like Chinese characters, but not any he recognized. There was something else too. The pouch had a smell, faint but distinct, not unpleasant exactly, but organic, like dried herbs mixed with something else he couldn't identify. Inside the pouch, he could feel small objects, not just herbs, something harder, like small stones or pieces of bone. He thought about opening it to look inside, but something stopped him. The woman's words echoed in his head, "Don't let anyone else touch." James decided to do some research. He went to an internet cafe and started Googling Malaysian amulets and protection charms. What he found made his stomach drop. There were dozens of articles about tourists being targeted with cursed objects in Southeast Asia, stories of people who accepted gifts from strangers, only to find themselves experiencing nightmares, bad luck, or worse. Some of the accounts described exactly what James was experiencing, the feeling of being followed, whispers, shadows, and photographs. One article particularly caught his attention. It was from a Malaysian newspaper, dated just 6 months earlier. The headline read, "Tourist scam involving cursed amulets continues to target visitors." The article described a sophisticated con where elderly women would approach tourists in markets and tourist areas, offering them protection amulets. The amulets weren't for protection at all. They were designed to make the person vulnerable to spiritual attack. Once someone accepted the amulet and kept it with them, they would begin experiencing supernatural harassment. Eventually, they would become so desperate that they'd pay large sums of money to have the curse removed. James's hands were shaking as he read. This was exactly what had happened to him. The woman, the night market, the insistence that he keep the amulet with him always. He'd walked right into it. But according to the article, it got worse. The longer someone kept the cursed amulet, the stronger the attachment became. What started as feeling watched could escalate to physical manifestations, health problems, even dangerous situations where the person might harm themselves or others. James immediately wanted to throw the pouch away, but the article warned against that too. Simply discarding a cursed object could cause it to bounce back with increased intensity. The only way to properly remove the curse was through specific rituals performed by qualified spiritual practitioners. The problem was, James had no idea who to trust. If there were people running scams with cursed amulets, how could he know which spiritual practitioners were legitimate and which were just part of the same con? He spent the rest of the day researching, trying to find reliable information about how to handle his situation. Most of the advice he found online was conflicting or seemed questionable. Some sources said to bury the object at a crossroads at midnight. Others insisted it needed to be returned to water. Still, others claimed that only a Buddhist monk or Muslim imam could properly neutralize it. As evening approached, James felt increasingly desperate. The whispers were getting louder, and he was starting to see movement in his peripheral vision, dark shapes that vanished when he looked directly at them. He decided to call the Australian embassy, thinking they might have experience with this kind of terrorist problem. The person he spoke to was sympathetic, but not particularly helpful. "We do get reports of scams involving spiritual items," the embassy worker told him, "but we can't really recommend specific religious practitioners. Your best bet is probably to go to a legitimate temple or mosque and ask for help." James thanked him and hung up, feeling more alone than ever. He was in a foreign country, dealing with something he didn't understand, and he had no idea who he could trust. That night, alone in his hostel room, James barely slept. The whispers had turned into what sounded like conversations in a language he didn't recognize. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from inside the room. Once, he could have sworn he heard someone laughing softly right next to his ear. Every time he started to drift off, he would jolt awake with the sensation that someone was touching him. His skin felt crawly, like insects were walking on it. When he looked in the mirror, his face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there a few days ago. James knew he needed help, but he was terrified of making the situation worse. Tomorrow, he decided, he would have to take the risk of approaching someone for help. He just hoped it wouldn't be too late. The presence in his room seemed to sense his decision. As he lay in bed, trying to ignore the whispers and the feeling of being watched, he could have sworn he heard something that sounded almost like approval, like whatever was attached to him was pleased with how things were progressing. The morning after his restless night, James woke up feeling worse than ever. His reflection in the hostel bathroom mirror showed someone who looked genuinely ill. Dark circles under his eyes, pale complexion, and there was something else. A rash had appeared on his arms overnight, small red bumps that itched constantly. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was allergic to something he'd eaten, or the humidity was getting to him. But deep down, he knew this was connected to the amulet. The timing was too coincidental. James spent the morning researching temples and spiritual practitioners in Kuala Lumpur. He needed help, but he had to be careful not to walk into another scam. After reading dozens of reviews and forum posts, he decided to visit the Thian Hao Temple. It was one of the largest Chinese temples in Southeast Asia, well established and legitimate. If anyone there could help him, at least he could trust they weren't running some tourist con. The temple was about 20 minutes by taxi from his hostel. As the car wound its way up the hill to the temple complex, James felt a strange resistance, like something was trying to discourage him from going there. The whispers, which had been constant background noise for days, suddenly got louder and more agitated. When he stepped out of the taxi at the temple entrance, the sensation was overwhelming. The moment his feet touched the ground, the whispers turned into what sounded almost like screaming, but so faint only he could hear it. The rash on his arms began burning. The Thian Hao Temple was beautiful, a massive six-tiered complex with traditional Chinese architecture, red pillars and sweeping rooftops. Hundreds of people were moving through the courtyards, lighting incense, praying, taking photos. It should have felt peaceful, but for James, it felt like walking into enemy territory. He approached one of the temple volunteers, an elderly Chinese woman who spoke good English. "Excuse me," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to speak to someone about a spiritual problem. Someone gave me an amulet, and I think it might be cursed." The woman studied his face carefully, and James could see recognition in her eyes. This wasn't the first time someone had come to her with this problem. "You come with me," she said quietly. We find someone to help. She led him through several courtyards to a smaller building behind the main temple. Inside, it looked more like an office than a religious space. A middle-aged man in casual clothes was sitting behind a desk, but James could see ritual objects and religious texts on shelves around the room. The woman spoke to the man in rapid Cantonese, occasionally gesturing toward James. The man's expression grew serious as she talked. Finally, he turned to James and spoke in accented but clear English. I am Mr. Chen. Sister Liu tells me you have problem with cursed object. Show me. James pulled the red pouch from his backpack. The moment it came into view, both Mr. Chen and Sister Liu took a step back. Mr. Chen muttered something in Chinese, then looked at James with what appeared to be a mixture of sympathy and concern. Where you get this? He asked. James explained the encounter at the night market, how the old woman had insisted he take the amulet for protection, how the problems had started almost immediately. Mr. Chen nodded grimly. This is Bikang, very bad magic. Not for protection, for control. He examined the pouch without touching it. You see symbol here? This is for binding spirits to person. Make them vulnerable. Can you remove it? James asked desperately. While Mr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. It's possible, but not simple. This type of curse is designed to get stronger over time. Already you have symptoms. The rash, yes, hearing, things, feeling watched. James nodded. Will get worse if we do nothing. But removing in proper way can cause, how you say, backlash, make things much worse very quickly. James felt his stomach drop. What kind of backlash? Depends how strong attachment is now. Could be accident, sickness, very bad luck that follow you a long time. Sometimes the spirits that were called, they get angry when binding is broken, wrong way. They might try to harm person who broke free. Sister Liu spoke up in English. But if he does nothing, what happens? Mr. Chen's expression darkened. Eventually, the curse take complete hold. Person become like puppet, do things they not want to do, sometimes hurt themselves or others. The people who make these curses, they want victim to come back, desperate, willing to pay anything to make it stop. James felt sick. So what do I do? We can help, Mr. Chen said. But will take time. Cannot be done quickly or cheaply. Need proper ritual, specific materials, and most important, need to find out exactly what type of spirits were bound to this object. James felt sick. So what do I do? First, you must examine the amulet more carefully, but cannot touch directly. Too dangerous for everyone involved. Mr. Chen called over another temple volunteer, a younger man who spoke excellent English, and explained the situation. The younger man, who introduced himself as David, nodded grimly. This is more common than you might think. Tourist police in KL have been cracking down on these scams, but the people behind them are clever. They target foreigners who don't understand local customs. David explained that there were different levels of these cursed amulets. Some were designed to just cause minor bad luck and supernatural harassment, enough to scare the victim into paying for removal. But others, particularly those that looked as old and elaborate as the one James carried, were much more dangerous. The symbol on your amulet, David said, peering at it from a safe distance. That's not Chinese. It's a binding sigil, probably Vietnamese or Cambodian origin. Very old style of magic, much more serious than the simple stuff most scammers use. Mr. Chen spoke to David in Cantonese again, then turned back to James. We need to take you to someone with more experience. This is beyond what we can safely handle here. I know a bomo, a traditional healer, who specializes in removing this type of curse. But must warn you, the process will not be pleasant. James's heart sank. What do you mean? When spirits have been attached to person for several days, they become protective of their host. Removing them forcefully can cause them to lash out. You may experience physical and mental effects during cleansing ritual. Sometimes people become violent, speak in languages they don't know, or have what Western medicine would call seizures. The thought terrified James, but he knew he had no choice. The alternative was to let whatever was attached to him grow stronger until it completely took over his life. David offered to accompany James to the Bomo's house that evening. It's better to do these rituals after sunset, he explained. The spirits are more active then, which makes them easier to identify and remove. James spent the rest of the day at the temple. afraid to leave in case the supernatural harassment got worse. The whispers had become almost constant now, sometimes in what sounded like multiple voices, having conversations he couldn't understand. The rash on his arms had spread to his chest and back, and he started experiencing what felt like muscle spasms. Several times, temple visitors looked at him strangely. One elderly Chinese woman actually crossed herself and hurried away when she saw him. David explained that sensitive people could sometimes perceive the dark energy around someone who was under supernatural attack. She probably saw the shadow figures that follow you, David said matter-of-factly. People with spiritual sight can see them clearly. James felt a chill. There are things following me, 2 or 3, from what I can sense. Small spirits, probably bound to the amulet to cause harassment and fear. There is something else too, something bigger that's been drawn to the spiritual disturbance. That's what we're really worried about. As evening approached, James felt his anxiety skyrocket. He called Sarah again, but didn't know how to explain what was happening without sounding completely insane. I'm dealing with some health issues, he told her. Nothing serious. Just, I might need to extend my trip by a few days to see a local doctor. Sarah was concerned, but supportive. Just take care of yourself, okay? And let me know if you need me to fly out there. James thanked her and hung up, wishing he could tell her the truth, but knowing she'd think he'd lost his mind. At sunset, David led James to a taxi. The Bomo lived in a kampong, a traditional village, about an hour outside Kuala Lumpur. As they drove through the darkening streets, James noticed that the whispers were getting more agitated. By the time they reached the village, he could have sworn he heard his name being called repeatedly in voices he didn't recognize. The Bomo's house was a simple wooden structure surrounded by tropical plants and trees. Wind chimes hung from the eaves, creating soft musical sounds in the evening breeze. Despite the pleasant appearance, James felt a strong reluctance to approach the front door, like something was physically trying to push him away. The Bomo herself was a small, elderly Malay woman named Sheikh Maina. She wore a simple white headscarf and spoke only Malay and a little Chinese, so David translated for James. When David explained the situation and showed her the amulet, Sheikh Maina's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She stepped back quickly, said something sharp in Malay, and made what looked like protective gestures with her hands. She says this is very serious, black magic, David translated, not tourist scam level. This is real sorcery, designed to completely destroy someone's life. She wants to know if you have any idea who might want to harm you this badly. James was confused. I thought it was just a random tourist scam. David spoke with Ikemaina again, then turned back to James with a troubled expression. She says this level of curse requires specific targeting. Someone would need your full name, your photograph, and ideally something personal belonging to you to create something this powerful. The woman who gave it to you must have gathered this information somehow. James thought back to the encounter at the night market. The woman had asked his name, where he was from, how long he'd been traveling. She'd seemed so friendly and concerned, but now he realized she'd been gathering personal information to strengthen the curse. But why? James asked. I'm nobody. I don't have money or enemies. David posed the question to Chikmina, who responded at length in Malay. She says there are several possibilities. Maybe you were chosen randomly, but someone paid for a very expensive curse to test the sorcerer's power. Maybe you remind someone of a person who hurt them. Or maybe, David hesitated. What? Maybe they plan to demand a large payment to remove it. This type of curse would cost tens of thousands of dollars to have removed by the person who cast it. Much more than simple tourist scam. James felt sick to his stomach. Someone had targeted him specifically with powerful black magic, either for revenge or as part of an elaborate extortion scheme. Chikamaina gestured for James to follow her to the back of the house, where she had set up what was clearly a ritual space, candles, incense burners, bowls of water, and various objects James didn't recognize were arranged on a low table. The Bomo began lighting incense and muttering what sounded like prayers or incantations. David explained that Sheikh Maina would first try to communicate with the spirits attached to James to understand their nature and the terms of their binding. Only then could she determine the safest way to remove them. She needs you to sit in the center of that circle, David said, pointing to a ring of white powder that had been drawn on the floor, and you must give her the amulet, but she'll use tools to handle it. Don't touch it with your bare hands. James sat cross-legged in the circle, feeling more vulnerable than he'd ever felt in his life. The moment Sigmina began her incantations, the whispers around him turned into what sounded like screaming. The burning sensation on his skin intensified, and he began to feel dizzy. "Don't leave the circle, no matter what happens," David warned. "The protective barrier will keep the spirits from fully manifesting, but if you step outside, you'll be completely vulnerable." For the next hour, James endured the most terrifying experience of his life. Tigimina chanted in Malay, in what sounded like other languages, occasionally throwing herbs into the fire or sprinkling water around the room. The spirit's reaction was violent. James felt like invisible hands were grabbing at him. The temperature in the room seemed to fluctuate wildly, and several times he heard what sounded like furniture being thrown around, though nothing actually moved. The worst part was when Hikmina began directly addressing the spirits. James couldn't understand the words, but he could hear responses that seemed to come from right next to his ears. Harsh, angry voices, arguing with the Bomo in languages he'd never heard. Finally, Sigmina sat back and spoke to David at length. Her expression was grave. She's identified 3 bound spirits and one that was attracted by the spiritual disturbance. David translated. The good news is that the binding was done hastily, probably within the last few weeks. If it had been done properly over months or years, it would be almost impossible to remove safely. What's the bad news? The spirits are very angry, and they've been feeding off your fear and confusion. They're stronger now than when they were first bound to you. The removal process will be intense. James nodded, steeling himself. Just get them out of me. Sigmina began the actual removal ritual. She had James hold his hands palm up while she worked with the cursed amulet, using a pair of metal tongs. As she began cutting the binding threads that held the pouch together, James felt like his entire body was on fire. The spirit's reaction was immediate and violent. James began convulsing uncontrollably, and the voices that had been whispering suddenly seemed to be shouting from inside his own head. He heard himself making sounds he'd never made before, guttural noises that didn't seem human. Amulets. At one point, he became aware that he was speaking, but not in English or any language he knew. The words seemed to be coming from somewhere else, using his voice but not originating from his conscious mind. David later told him that the spirits had been threatening Sigmina in ancient Khmer, warning her that removing them would bring terrible consequences. But the Bamo had continued her work, methodically severing the spiritual attachments while protecting herself with prayers and ritual tools. The climax came when Sigmina finally opened the amulet and removed its contents. James caught a glimpse of what looked like small bones, dried herbs, and what might have been human hair before she quickly threw everything into the fire. The moment the contents hit the flames, James felt like he'd been struck by lightning. Every muscle in his body seized, he screamed involuntarily, and then suddenly everything went quiet. The whispers stopped. The burning sensation on his skin faded. For the first time in days, James felt alone inside his own head. He looked up to find Chikmaina and David watching him carefully. The Bamo said something in Malay and smiled for the first time that evening. "It's done," David translated. "The spirits have been banished and the curse is broken, but she says you need to be very careful for the next few days. Sometimes there can be after effects." James felt overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. What kind of after effects? Your spiritual defenses are still weak from the attack. You might attract other spirits or negative energy more easily for a while. She's going to give you some protective items to carry, and she strongly recommends that you leave Malaysia as soon as possible. Why? David's expression was serious. Because whoever did this to you is still out there, and now they know their curse has been removed. James felt overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. What kind of after effects? The spiritual defenses are still weak from the attack. You might attract other spirits or negative energy more easily for a while. She's going to give you some protective items to carry, and she strongly recommends that you leave Malaysia as soon as possible. Why? David's expression was serious. Because whoever did this to you is still out there, and now they know their curse has been removed. James felt a chill run down his spine. How would they know? When a binding is broken, especially one this strong, the person who cast it feels it immediately. It's like a spiritual cord being severed. They'll know that someone with real power helped you, and they might not be happy about that. Takimanai gave James several items to protect himself: a small silver amulet blessed in proper ceremonies, a packet of protective herbs to carry with him, and a piece of paper with prayers written in Jawi script that she instructed him to keep in his wallet. These are real protection, David translated. Not like the cursed object you received, but they will only work if you truly believe and if you avoid places and people connected to black magic. The Bomo also gave James specific instructions for the next few days. He was to avoid going out alone after dark, stay away from crowded markets and tourist areas where the scam operators worked, and most importantly, book a flight out of Malaysia within 48 hours. As they drove back to Kuala Lumpur, James felt like a completely different person. The constant whispers had stopped. The feeling of being watched was gone, and for the first time in days, he felt alone inside his own head. The rash on his arms was already starting to fade. But David's warning stayed with him. As they reached the city, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was still in danger. Back at his hostel, James immediately went online to change his flight. He'd originally planned to stay in Malaysia for another week, but now he just wanted to get home. The earliest flight to Melbourne was the next evening, and he booked it without hesitation. That night, James barely slept, but not because of supernatural harassment. He was just too wired from the whole experience. He kept thinking about how close he'd come to being completely destroyed by something he didn't even believe in. The next morning, he called Sarah and told her he was coming home early. "I thought you loved Malaysia," she said. "You were posting about how much you wanted to explore more of the country." I'm ready to come home," James said. "I'll tell you everything when I see you." James spent his last day in KL keeping a low profile. He stayed in well-lit, crowded areas, avoided markets entirely, and didn't talk to any strangers. Several times he thought he spotted the old woman who had given him the cursed amulet, but he couldn't be sure. Every elderly Chinese woman in a floral shirt made him nervous. At the airport that evening, James felt safer, but still anxious. As he checked in for his flight, the airline staff member, a young Malaysian woman, looked at him strangely. "Sir, are you feeling all right? You look very tired." James realized he must still look pretty rough from everything he'd been through. "Just ready to get home," he said. As he waited at his gate, James reflected on everything that had happened a week ago. He'd been a skeptical backpacker who thought supernatural beliefs were just cultural superstition. Now, he knew firsthand that there were things in this world he couldn't understand or explain. The flight to Melbourne was uneventful, and James slept for most of it. When he woke up as they were descending, he felt like the entire experience in Malaysia might have been a dream, but the protective amulet around his neck and the herbs in his backpack reminded him that it had all been very real. Sarah met him at the airport, and the moment she saw him, she knew something significant had happened. "James, you look like you've been through hell. What happened over there?" In the car on the way home, James told her everything about the old woman at the market, the cursed amulet, the supernatural harassment, the temple visit, and the Bamos ritual. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. "I know how it sounds," James said when he finished. "I know you probably think I had some kind of breakdown or something." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Actually," she said finally, "I don't think you're crazy. My grandmother always warned me about accepting spiritual items from strangers when traveling. She said different cultures have different rules about these things, and if you don't understand them, you can get into serious trouble." James felt a wave of relief that Sarah believed him. Over the next few weeks, he gradually readjusted to life in Melbourne, but the experience had changed him fundamentally. He found himself more sensitive to spiritual atmospheres and places, more careful about accepting gifts from strangers, and much more respectful of cultural beliefs that he'd once dismissed. 3 months later, James received a message on social media from David, the temple volunteer who had helped him. "Thought you should know," the message read. Tourist police raided a scam operation in Petaling Street Market last month. They arrested 6 people, including an elderly woman who was targeting foreigners with cursed amulets. She had a whole operation set up, with people gathering personal information about tourists and then cursing items specifically for each victim. You weren't the only one, but you were lucky to get help when you did. Some of the other victims weren't so fortunate. James showed the message to Sarah. "So it was all real," she said. "Someone really did target you specifically." "Yeah," James replied. "Makes me wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found help." He never found out what happened to the woman who had cursed him, but he didn't really want to know. What mattered was that he had escaped, learned from the experience, and could warn others. James eventually returned to traveling, but he was much more cautious about accepting gifts from strangers, especially spiritual or cultural items. He also made it a point to research local beliefs and customs before visiting new places, understanding that being a respectful traveler meant more than just being polite. It meant understanding that some cultural practices could be genuinely dangerous if you didn't approach them properly. So what exactly happened to James? And why are these types of supernatural scams so common in Southeast Asia? Let me explain the cultural and spiritual context that makes stories like this possible. First, it's important to understand that in Malaysia and much of Southeast Asia, supernatural beliefs aren't just cultural curiosities. They're living, practiced realities that affect daily life for millions of people. The belief in spirits, curses, and protective magic is deeply embedded in traditional Malaysian culture. Whether you're talking about Malay Muslim traditions, Chinese folk religion, or indigenous beliefs, the type of curse James encountered is known as bekang in some Malaysian Chinese communities, or santau in Malay tradition. These are binding curses designed to attach negative spirits to a person, making them vulnerable to spiritual attack and bad luck. The purpose is usually to weaken someone, so they become desperate enough to pay for expensive removal rituals. What makes these scams so effective is that they combine real spiritual practices with criminal intent. The woman who cursed James wasn't just running a simple compromise. She was using actual techniques from traditional black magic, but for the purpose of extortion rather than legitimate spiritual reasons. Here's how the scam typically works. Operators identify foreign tourists who seem wealthy or naive about local customs. They approach them in markets or tourist areas with stories designed to elicit personal information. Your full name, where you're from, details about your family. This information is then used to create personalized cursed objects. The cursed items are real, in the sense that they're created using traditional methods that locals genuinely believe will attract negative spiritual attention to the victim. The psychological and spiritual pressure this creates often leads to exactly the symptoms James experienced as of feeling watched, hearing whispers, seeing shadows, developing mysterious health problems. The scammers then wait for the victim to become desperate enough to seek help. At this point, they or their associates pose as spiritual healers who can remove the cursed para for a substantial fee, often thousands of dollars. What James encountered was actually a more sophisticated version of the scam. The level of curse used on him suggests he was specifically targeted, not randomly chosen. Someone gathered detailed personal information about him and invested significant time and resources into creating a powerful spiritual attack. This indicates he was either very unlucky or someone identified him as a particularly valuable target. The Malaysian government has been cracking down on these operations in recent years. Tourist police in Kuala Lumpur now regularly raid fake spiritual healers and arrest people running supernatural scams. But the practice continues because it's so profitable, and because the line between legitimate traditional healing and criminal activity can sometimes be difficult to define legally. For travelers, the lesson is clear. Never accept spiritual or religious items from strangers, especially items that are supposed to provide protection or bring good luck. In traditional Asian cultures, genuine protective amulets are blessed by recognized religious authorities, and given specific ceremonies, they're not handed out randomly to tourists in markets. If you're interested in traditional spiritual practices while traveling, always go through established temples, recognized healers, or reputable cultural organizations. And remember, in many Asian cultures, spiritual power is not taken lightly. It's not entertainment or curiosity. It's a serious matter that requires proper respect and understanding. James's story is a reminder that when we travel, especially to places with deep spiritual traditions, we need to approach those traditions with genuine respect and caution. What might seem like harmless tourist experiences can sometimes have very real consequences that we don't understand until it's too late. The supernatural world, whether you believe in it or not, is taken very seriously in many parts of Asia, and that seriousness, unfortunately, can sometimes be exploited by people with criminal intent.